was already prepared. Saturday, the 7th of September, was another hot summer's day. Against the late afternoon sky, it was easy to mistake the silver glint of approaching planes for RAF maneuvers until the firestorm began. At about 5 p.m., the first of 400 Lankan Dornier bombers began their descent over London. Another 400.
The banner bearing President Kim Il-sung's portrait and the square and US under covers of the Korean People's Army.
A very good evening to every one of you. First, let me introduce myself a little. I'm Sasadu Induvara, the president of Ananda College Model United Nations Association for the years 2020 and 2021. So I welcome you all with utmost pleasure to this online webinar series on Why Wars Happen, a Geopolitical Analysis, organized by our club and conducted by Dr.Vagisha Gunasekara. So in today's session, we will be discussing about capitalism and logic of war under the theme of Why Wars Happen, a Geopolitical Analysis. So before moving on to the lecture session, let me give a brief introduction about the lecturer for today's session and also as well to tomorrow's session. So she's a Sri Lankan political economist. Her entire education was completed in the United States, where she was exposed to liberal arts, education, and social science research. Her BA from Concordia College, Minnesota, is in economics with minors in politics and philosophy. She has 2 masters in political science from North Dakota State University and Purdue University. She has taught a number of undergraduate courses at Purdue University, and she taught global politics and human rights in the summer program at the Center for Talented Youth at Princeton University, United States. So influenced by her academic training in political economy, her research is concerned with interactions between global forms and local political economy of emerging contexts. She has spent the past 15 years studying the political economy of war in South and Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. She has conducted research in Sri Lanka, United States, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Uganda, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Rwanda, and the DRC. In Sri Lanka, she has conducted field research in Hambantota, Anuradhapura, Jaffna, Mannar, and Batticaloa. She is fluent in Urdu, Hindi, and Dari, other than her native language, Sinhala. So, without any further ado, now I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara to continue with today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasindu, and let me thank the Model UN of Ananda College for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I hope it's not one of those after-school boring lectures. I hope you are all engaged, and we are actually talking about a very interesting topic. Why do wars happen, right? And a lot of you, I'm assuming, that you come from backgrounds and or your interests are to understand how the global system works. And you may have your own opinions about why wars happen. So the point is not to sort of, you have to challenge me, not to believe everything I say, because as Sasindu correctly pointed out, and Dilaka before that when he was introducing me, I'm a political economist. And we are an old breed, actually, political economists. We don't separate the realms of the economy or politics. We kind of study them together. Whereas in, in higher education institutions that you see everywhere in the world now, these two are silos. They're two different disciplines, and they often don't talk to each other. So my background in economics, philosophy, and I also have a keen interest in history, because you cannot become a political economist without knowing world history and also the history of the region that you're interested in studying. So I look at the world, I look at the country, I look at our society by combining both politics and the economy. So my perspectives may be different to what you have learned about in school, or what you have read online, or what your parents have told you, basically your education, right? What your education has taught you. So I'm here to challenge you a little bit and talk about why wars happen, perhaps in slightly different way. So before we start, I want to sort of draw your attention to the current context that we live in, which is COVID, and also shifting balance of power. Since World War II, and particularly after the Cold War ended in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we have been used to a unipolar world. However, now things are changing. Things are changing into a multipolar world. So we have to think about COVID as well as these changing polarities of political polarities of the world simultaneously. I don't have to go into detail about the health impact of COVID. I also don't have to go into detail about the economic impacts of COVID, well, which got exacerbated with COVID. COVID was not the cause of this economic decline that we see in the world. It simply was an exacerbating factor to bring about economic decline and perhaps a recession, right? It's a little difficult to foresee details of what is in store for the future. But we can speculate based on what we know already about where the world is heading in terms of economic powers as well as political powers and military powers. All these changes and all these factors and crises that we're experiencing at this time, they are pointing to a very different world from what we have been seeing. As I said before, the traditional powers of the West are strongly, they're not as strong economically, and they're not also very confident of their social and organizational superiority. If you remember the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, that's an indicator of social decline and decay and perhaps even a crisis. China, though, along with developing countries in Asia and Africa that have better weathered the COVID storm, will likely increase their global footprint at a much faster rate than they have been doing in the past decades. So in this context, it is in this context that I'm talking to you. I think it's important to understand the dynamic nature of these shifts. That's one thing. Let me share my screen with you. I made a PowerPoint presentation, which is nothing like the beautiful video that was made by the Ananda College Model UN folks. That was really cool. I can't match that, but I did make this. So today the objective is to understand the dynamic nature of these shifts, shifting power, relationship between capitalism and war, which is where my contribution comes from. I'm sure you have your own explanations as to why power is shifting. But my contribution as a political economist comes from this second point. I'm going to talk about capitalism and the logic of war. And then we can explore regional manifestations, but particularly the Indian Ocean region, which will happen tomorrow during tomorrow's webinar, and of course, implications for Sri Lanka. I see we have a friend from India who is joining us. Very welcome, warmly welcome you today. And I hope that you engage with us. I saw somebody's name and said India, so I'm assuming somebody from India is joining us, perhaps another Model UN person. All right, this is my outline for today. I'm going to talk about capitalism and its inherent crises, the logic of capitalism and the logic of war, why war is crucial for the expansion of capitalism, which is a significant part of today's lecture. And of course, we are going to talk about these in the context of World War I, World War II, and also after 1945, after the end of the Second World War, how the nature of war changed. Basically, the idea of world wars, or world war as we know it in World War I and World War II, never happened after 1945, but the nature changed, right? And then we'll also, towards the end of it, if we have time, I want to talk about in what form did dominance prevail after 1945. All right, moving on. And if you have any questions, please type them or bring them up during our question and answer session in the end. All right. Now, the history of capitalism has been punctuated by periodic struggles of power and domination, what we call hegemony, okay? It's like an overarching power that influences our lives, our ideas, and a power not only in terms of military strength, but also ideological strength, right? So history of capitalism has been punctuated by these struggles for power and domination over the world economy, leading to a centuries-long series of world wars. And in the 21st century, all signs are pointing to another period of hegemonic struggle, this time between the United States and China. So, although, complicated in this case by very unique, indeterminate aspects of post-revolutionary Chinese social formation, which is probably a topic for another day. China is neither capitalist nor socialist, nor entirely socialist. So it's sort of like an oddball in the international system, right? So in the Council of Foreign Relations in the United States, Richard Haas, a key architect of Imperial America strategy of George W. Bush administration, he is writing in August 2020, he says, the chances of a second Cold War with China are far higher than they were just months ago. Even worse, the chances of an actual war are also greater. Now, this was before Joe Biden was elected as the President of the United States. And I see that from his speeches last week and the week before, his tone is changing. The Americans, they're changing their positions, right? But we cannot deny that there has been a friction between these established and rising, and well, one power is already risen, that's the United States, and rising power is China. So why is this constant talk of this rivalry and war, right? Why is that? What is the relationship between capitalism and war? Because a lot of this is also couched in economic terms, because there's a trade war, right? And the trade war is very much at the center of this rivalry between the United States and China. So the link between war and capitalist expansion has been the interest of many Marxist scholars, ranging from Rosa Luxemburg to Friedrich Engels, Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and of course, Karl Marx himself. For those of you who haven't read anything written by Karl Marx, I highly encourage you to read his magnum opus called Das Kapital. And of course, Marx died without completing it, but Friedrich Engels, he completed all the volumes of Das Kapital. Das Kapital in German means the capital, right? It's about the world economic system. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to simplify the ideas and explain the link between capitalism, capitalist expansion, and war. I'll do it in 3 steps. And you'll have to bear with me for the jargon or like some theoretical concepts, which may not be ideal at this hour of the day, but it's important. So what is our current model of production? Our current economy is based on these 3 things. We take, that means we extract natural resources, and then we put human resources into it. We make stuff, right? Production of goods and services. And then we sell those goods and services to the same people who produce and others in exchange for money. And then the third part of this is that we dispose, okay? We generate waste, which is dumped back into the environment. This is a linear model, right? We go from one step to the other to the other. So in this linear system of production, we call this the capitalist mode of production. In Marx's Das Kapital, volume number 3, chapter 15, section 1, to be precise, he outlines 2 main methods that capitalists use to make profits and to accumulate more capital. The first is to exploit labor. The second is to exploit natural resources. Then you sell more and more goods that were produced by exploiting labor. So the difference between the cost of labor and the price and the volume of goods sold equals your profit. I mean, we all know this. This is common sense. If there is no profit, what happens? Businesses close down, people lose jobs, both businesses and people will no longer be able to pay off debt, banking systems collapse, and governments will quickly run out of money. In other words, there will be an economic crisis. So according to Marx, the tendency for crises within capitalist system is inevitable. Why does he say that, right? Well, the way in which capitalists strive to earn more and more profits is by increasing production and expanding their market, right? We want to sell more and more stuff to people. That's why there's such a push to buy certain things, right? Like just look at how many things you have as a student, right? You don't need this many things. And surely students like 10 years ago or 20 years ago didn't have this many things, but you think you need them, right? And that's advertising, that's the market at work. So, so according to Marx, the tendency for crisis within the capitalist system is inevitable. And why does he say that? The way in which capitalists try to earn more and more profits is by increasing production and expanding their markets. As a result, you have more and more exploitation. There's intensification of exploitation. And this leads to a situation of overproduction of goods and services over time, and the constant need to create more and more markets to sell your goods. So even now, as we speak, this trend is happening around the world. What we can glean from this is that due to increasing overproduction of goods and services, what we call the profit ratio, there's my slide. The profit ratio, or the rate of profit, as Marx calls it, it decreases over time. And the declining profit ratio is the fundamental reason for capitalist processes to go into crisis mode. Okay? And sorry, there's a typo. Marxian theory of declining profit ratio, right? This is what happens. When you have high profit ratio, business investment is high, unemployment is relatively low, living standards of workers generally rises. But the Marxists argue that you cannot sustain a high profit ratio over time. It is invariably set up for failure. So then high profit ratio over time, it declines and it becomes a low profit ratio, and businesses close down, people lose jobs, and banks collapse and governments run out of money. So this, I think you have to understand it not like a shock to the system. It's more like it's a gradual process. Like, look at this heap of sand, right? If you look at the heap of sand, it's not, the whole sand heap is not going to collapse immediately. But once there's a critical slope and there's an avalanche occurs when that last grain falls out of that critical slope, right? So then the entire heap of sand, it collapses. This is the way in which you can understand economic crises. And I'm just going to show you some slides about how to prove to you that the profit ratio has been declining over the years. So since 1950, and this slide couldn't accommodate the recent period, but the line is all the way down. All right. Now you can see here. You can see how it goes up and down, this the profit ratio, and now we are in that mini recession well below. Okay, this is to just demonstrate the declining profit ratio. Right. So history has shown that we have attempted to come out of crises by waging wars, and this is the last step of my analysis. So this is to say, this interconnected global economic system is prone to internal contradictions from time to time because the profit ratio cannot be sustained. And the way we have thus far attempted to come out of crises has been to wage wars. We tend to assume that it's political factors or race or ethnicity or social unrest that causes wars and conflict, while political, social, or even cultural factors are important and they can be triggers, right? The root cause of all wars is often economic crises that have been brewing for a long time. So what happens then during wars, right? Why does capitalism push us towards wars? Well, what happens is that the existing economic, political, social, cultural, and psychological processes are disrupted entirely. War facilitates dismantling of structures, all of these structures, politics, economy, society, culture, everything, right? And it also gives an opportunity to reconstruct them, right? Wars also create very lucrative war economies around military supplies and other goods. Okay, now I'm coming to world wars. So way before World War I took place, Friedrich Engels predicted in 1887 that World War I would happen and that it would reconfigure the imperialist political structure in the world. What do we call an imperialist political structure? An empire. That power that holds political, economic, social, and ideological, and even cultural domination. So right now it's the United States, right? All of you know the Big Mac. All of you subscribe to democracy. All of you watch Hollywood, right? Now, these are not military things. These are very ideological things. These are cultural things. So United States has been very influential. It's the world hegemony, right? So that's what we call an imperial power or an empire. It's politically, militarily, economically, culturally, socially, it's extremely strong, very powerful, right? And it bulldozes any other counter narratives, alternative narratives, right? So Engels made this prediction in 1887. World War I took place in 1914, and of course, subsequently, the Russian Revolution took place in 1917. So the Marxist theory of imperialism, again, a little bit of theory. So Marxists claim that the highest stage of capitalism is imperialism and the domination of the world economy, like the US. So what happens when we have this world system, there is military competition for markets between capitalist nations. This is an inevitable thing. And it's actually at the beginning, it's peaceful competition. When small countries or small units in the international system, when they compete for military power or military markets, right? But over time, Marxists argue that these small units of military producers or units of capital, as they call it, which is how early capitalism used to be, they swallow each other up into larger and fewer concerns and monopolies. So that's how one becomes an empire. You control the monopoly for military supplies and various other things. That's how you take over the world economy. So at this stage, organizationally, economics is fused with politics. Now think about just a simple market. At the beginning, all of you may be producers selling your goods, but as and when you become more powerful, you become a powerful player, you're no longer limited to the market. You have ties with politicians. You strike deals with them because now you're a big boy or a big girl in the market playing big, right? It's big money. So you have to have political connections. So the sheer scale of production in the industrializing nations could no longer be contained with geographical boundaries of the state, and you have to reach out beyond those limits. So when companies get bigger and bigger, they move overseas, right? Their scope becomes bigger. All right, now I must say something about the state. What is this thing that we call the state? The state, or the nation, is a governance structure that helps sustain capitalist processes. The state puts in place processes that facilitate capitalism. Today, capitalism, of course, extends beyond the nation states, which is what I just said, that the more you grow in the international economic system as a capitalist player or a business or a multinational corporation, your markets is beyond your own country. It's the entire world, right? This is what we call globalization. So the inherent tendency of the global economic system to connect in terms of production and markets beyond the boundaries of the nation state is what the Marxists are talking about. So the entire world, the land, the oceans, surface, and the interior is all, you can think of it like a big production factory. Every part is interconnected to carry forward that earlier what I said, the take, make, dispose, linear economic process of modern capitalism. Okay. So now, I mean, when we have the state that is looking out for capitalism, that is meant to facilitate capitalism, little by little, the interests of large firms, or what we call big capital, are merged with the state, and it backs them up politically and militarily. Okay, it builds up armies and weapons. States do that, governments do that. It invades countries. Look at the Gulf War, look at the war in Afghanistan, look at the war in Iraq, right? And, you know, where you do these invasions, you go and invade other countries to grab resources or to safeguard trade routes or markets, establish spheres of influence and alliances. And states will go to war against other powers to defend any of those things or all of them, right? And each war ends in what we call a political settlement. It's a new division of the world between the powers, but these agreements kind of never hold as static things. They change. Okay, moving on. Right. Now, this is World War I. Picture of World War I and the Russian Revolution. There's Vladimir Lenin. This Chinese Revolution, of course, after World War II. Oops, sorry. And what we notice when we look at the world economy and the world wars is that we see a correlation between unprecedented economic crises and the outbreak of a world war. There were many economic crises that led to World War I. After World War I, the world plunged into economic recession by 1928. Okay, and in fact, soon after that, the recession that took place in 1928, it plummeted into the Great Depression. It morphed into the Great Depression. It is in this context that Nazi Germany emerges, right? So, and then Nazi Germany and other countries during that time start developing aspirations to become the next imperial power. And observing these economic processes in Europe at the time, the leader of the Communist Party of Bulgaria, his name is Georgy Dimitrov, he predicted about another world war, which culminates into World War II, right? Now, you may challenge me, you may ask me the question, saying that, you know, I mean, after World War II, there have been enough economic crises. In fact, we are in an economic crisis right now, but we have not seen a world war. We are yet to see one, right? Why is that? Why do you think that is? The primary reason for that is that many powerful countries in the world have acquired nuclear weapons. In technical terms, we call this nuclear deterrence. Although the probability of a nuclear war is low, other forms of war has been happening, which I'll get to that in a bit. Just to give you a brief, I'm sure you know all about nuclear deterrence. This comes with the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb in 1945, but nuclear deterrence did not immediately happen, okay? The United States still had this doctrine of massive retaliation well into the 1950s against the Soviet Union. This started to happen when there was a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the United States really felt the threat of the Soviets beefing up their nuclear arsenal in a major way, right? So, so then that's when they started to get really worried about what would happen if both countries were to use nuclear bombs or warheads against each other. So it's then that the idea of nuclear deterrence came to the forefront of the US foreign policy. Now, this is a slide that I had copied from CIPRI, I believe, where it gives you an idea of how the timeline of this nuclear arms race between 1945 and then, of course, until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Right, and this is the current estimated global nuclear warheads. I'm not sure whether this is an accurate data because certain countries seem to conceal how many nuclear warheads they have. But as you can see, at one point, United States was far ahead of the rest of the world, but now guess who has caught up with the United States under the leadership of Vladimir Putin? It's Russia. And when you compare how many nuclear warheads that Russia and United States has, look at how massive their nuclear warhead arsenals are in comparison to other countries, right? Right. So although we have not seen a world war, there has been other kinds of war, right? Particularly during the Cold War and after that. We have seen the Korean War. I'm not going to go into details about each one of these wars, but I'll share this presentation with you so that you can go through them. We had the Vietnam War, and we had the Afghan War, where the United States, the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, entered neighboring Afghanistan. This was in 1979. This is a very important war for the modern war against terrorism, and we can talk about that on another day. And of course, this is the Gulf War, if you remember Operation Desert Storm. Not this, Operation Desert Storm 1, I think this was. This was when Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. And then we have the next Afghan war, which happened after September 11th, 2001, when Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden at the time, carried out suicide attacks in the United States, in New York City and the Pentagon. This is still going on. And then you have the Iraq War in 2003, where the United States decides to invade Iraq under speculations that Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq at the time, had weapons of mass destruction. And later on, General Colin Powell, the Secretary of Defense or State at the time, he admitted that there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. There was no such thing. Basically, they just wanted another war, right? So this is what I'm talking about in terms of war and capital. And we'll soon find out why we are creating wars, why it's so profitable to create wars. This is the latest, Syria's civil war and the United States and the allies getting involved. And of course, the emergence of the Islamic State, which the United States and the allies used to fund. And now they're fighting them and funding them. They're doing both in different contexts, okay? ISIS is an extremely complicated, a very complex, sort of like a zeitgeist to figure out. We'll talk about ISIS on another day, but there are lots of connections between ISIS, the Al-Qaeda, and then the Taliban and the US invasion of Afghanistan, and also years prior to that. Okay, so it has a long history. You cannot understand ISIS in the current context only. Okay, so why are these? Okay, before I go here, I want to say that it's not just war like this that is happening at the moment. Countries like North Korea are beefing up their nuclear arsenals in the name of national security. There is biological warfare. Although the United Nations banned the use of bioweapons, plenty of reports have been released about the use of bioweapons in Syria. And then there's space warfare. As we speak, various countries are destroying each other's satellites and space infrastructure. And it's another way that war is taking place today. Other examples are cyber war and, of course, international war against terrorism, right? And now this war against terrorism, which started with the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City, it was only a trigger point that kicked off a chain of wars, starting with Afghanistan, which later extended to Iraq, and then Libya, Syria, and Yemen, right? Now, I want to draw your attention to this because this is key to understanding the logic of war in capitalism. The military-industrial complex, which is a constellation that keeps the war machine well-oiled. This is the former American President, General Dwight Eisenhower. He was a general of the United States Army who later became a president. In his State of the Union address on January 17th, 1961, he warned the world of a birth of a military-industrial complex. He said, weapon manufacturers, defense contractors, governments and militaries are increasingly fusing with each other to produce a powerful bloc. He warned that those who steer the military-industrial complex will dominate the world. So after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, and to date, the front runner of the military-industrial complex has been the United States and its G7 and G8 allies. Okay. All right, so what is the military-industrial complex? It is, I would say, it's an unofficial alliance between a country's military, defense industry and governments, who we call policymakers. And why is it so powerful? What drives it? Well, it's mutual benefits and vested interests of government and defense contractors as both sides benefit from it. Governments start wars, hence create a demand for weapons and the military industry to grow. And the response comes from the defense industry, who produces various things, from bombs to weapons to military gear to everything, right? So how are they like mutually connected to each other? What kind of relationships do they have? So you will see that a lot of defense contractors, they have deep-rooted connections with oil companies in the world and also governments in terms of political contributions to electoral campaigns. If you want to go and check out who funded Biden's campaign, who funded Donald Trump's campaign, who funded Barack Obama's campaign, who funded George Bush's campaign, you will see it's the same people, right? They give massive political contributions. Without the blessings or the support of the defense industry, there will be no president elected in the United States, okay? So what they want in return is political approval for military spending. They lobby to support bureaucracies. They staff a lot of bureaucracies with former people who used to be part of defense contractors. For instance, if you remember, the former vice president of the United States, the main architect behind the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was not a military man. He was a double agent between defense contractors, big oil companies like Halliburton, and the United States government, right? And so they have a web where they have oversight. The industry has oversight on what's happening in government, and the government has oversight on the industry, vice versa. So there's a complex network of contracts and flows of money and resources among these people. We call them revolving doors, and lots of big corporations, right? And institutions of the defense contractors, private military contractors, the Pentagon and the Congress, they're all intertwined. They all have vested interests, mutually beneficial interests. This is another one of Eisenhower's quotes. He said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. And this is a general who's speaking like this. Under the clouds of war, it is humanity hanging on a cross of iron. And why are we talking about the military-industrial complex and the US? Because it originates from there. The US military budget is by far the highest in the world. And it's higher than any, I mean, the entire world put together, right? In the United States, the US military budget was 661 billion. And you can see the military spending of other countries, right? So it accounts for 43% of the world's military spending. This is in 2009, and it's higher now, right? And there's another dimension of this military industrial complex. The good way to look at it is by looking at who exports arms and who imports arms, right? I want to stop sharing this screen for a moment and show you something else. Why am I not? Oh, here. Look at this. This is from the Swedish arms transfers database. This is actually the most reliable source of data. This is the who exports arms in the world. Top 10 exporters of arms now. United States is still the front runner of the game, right? And it's beaten people, I mean, beaten the other countries by like a huge lead. And now I'm going to show you another one, which is who imports. So I'm going to show you demand and supply, right? Because supply is, we have looked at supply, now this is the demand. Where is that coming from? Look at now, top 10 countries that import arms. Number 1, India, and Saudi Arabia, then Australia. You see, India, Australia, Japan, all three have something in common. And if you can guess it, you can write it in the box. Why? What do they have in common? But they are currently the top defense spenders of on defense, right? They're the highest arms purchases in the world. Okay. Now, you may think, okay, because you are part of the model UN and all that, you may think that it was the World Bank Group and the United Nations that prevented another war. But I'm going to ask you to think again, because I actually have a different view about the World Bank Group and the IMF. Maybe this is a conversation for another day, okay? And I hope all of you don't take offense of my critique of the World Bank Group and the IMF. I know you're part of the model UN and you feel very strongly about this, but I want to say something about this because so that you also develop somewhat of a critical view of these institutions. So World Bank Group and the UN, right? That you have to take them together as a group. You can't think of them separately. So they were founded in 1944, so these are twin. If you take the World Bank and the IMF, we call them the bank. They are influential, very influential in shaping the structure of the world's development and financial order, right? Also known as Bretton Woods institutions, they were initially created with the intention of rebuilding the international economic system following World War II. Now, you may also recall that rules of international trade, which are extremely unfair to developing countries like ours, right? They were also established by this system, right? So the question I'm going to ask you, and I'm not going to provide an answer to that, is that Are they apolitical? Apolitical as in, are they completely neutral? Don't they take a position of any country? Do they treat every country equally? Okay, that's the question I'm going to leave you with. Because I have a different view, because I think that while the establishment of the bank and the fund and the UN was the cushion that was created in order to make the extremely extractive international trade agenda of the World Bank and the IMF look a little good. That's why they created the UN, so that there's this talk about democracy, institutions, and this ideal state, whatnot, right? But it is always on the back of this World Bank group that the United States operates, right? And although it's presented as an apolitical, non-political effort to rebuild the world war economy, there are some interpretations that view them as an effort to defend or expand the reach of Western capitalism in the face of a potential challenge from the Soviet Union, and to promote the United States interests in particular. If you look at who has the most, I mean, the World Bank is a bank, right? It has shareholders like any other business does. Who has most shares of the World Bank? It's the United States, right? So it was under the President Robert McNamara of the United States that the World Bank's mission became a little softer, right? And many of these things were also adopted by the United Nations, like focus on inequality, focus on poverty, right? However, in the 1980s and the 1990s, the policies championed by these institutions, we call them the Washington Consensus. They were pretty much imposed on countries like ours in the developing world. When we got into debt, they said, we will bail you out. You must follow these policy packages. And we call them structural adjustment programs. And they have been proven a failure everywhere in the world, okay? And they have also caused a lot of economic inequalities within countries and between countries, particularly between the developed world and the underdeveloped world. I could give an entire lecture on structural adjustment policies, and we are almost out of time, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'll leave you with these criticisms that have been leveled against the World Bank Group and the UN, right? The bank, the structural underrepresentation of the global south as in the developing world, biased and inconsistent decision-making, and it never learns from its past mistakes because it tends to repeat them. And also, it has never paid for its past mistakes and the damage they have caused. And the mass unemployment and the poverty that World Bank policies have caused in the world, they've never had to correct it. They've never had to rectify it. And the UN, of course, the UN Security Council in specific, does not embody a collective security agreement, okay? It favors some countries over others. The West still has a lot of clout in the United Nations and in the Security Council in particular. It's politically biased. It's not an independent entity in international politics, and it's not a receptacle of universal ideals either. So these are some of the criticisms leveled against them, and I'm just very quickly moving to review some concepts that we talked about today. We talked about the logic of war. We talked about nuclear deterrence, right? Why we don't go to world wars, right, with each other. But we also talked about proxy wars and wars by other means. And the crux of this conversation today is the military-industrial complex. And then we also talked about Marx and Friedrich Engels, their contribution to understanding the international system. And also lastly, in a very, very minor way, we talked about the Bretton Woods Agreement. And I just wanted to mention that because I know you're coming from that particular political orientation. So I just want to challenge you a little bit there. So with that, I will end and take any questions.
Thank you, madam, for that very elaborative and very informative lecture. So for the audience, if you all have any questions, you can unmute from your end and ask the question, or else you can drop them in the chat.
I think we have two. So wait, how does this contemporary rat race? Somebody, I think Buddhima is asking, how does this contemporary rat race of most capitalist nations contribute towards another war, like atmosphere in the current world context? Oh, sorry, you have said please don't mention name. I'm sorry. Well, I think what we are seeing is a continuation of these proxy wars. Now, you could think of the Easter attacks in Sri Lanka in the same way that we are thinking about the war in Afghanistan, the World Trade Center, the wars in Iraq and in Syria. We could think of these different theaters of war. It may not be a full-fledged war, right? And ISIS, right, Islamic State, was also a creation of this political economy of war, right? And as I said, I told Sasindu, maybe we can have a different lecture later on. If you leave aside ISIS's ideological backing, right, leave that aside, but what drives it materially? It's the military-industrial complex, okay? So what you will see, the answer to your question is that this rat race will lead to more and more wars unless the next superpower finds another way to expand capitalist processes, like a very dynamic, interconnected world market through the oceans and the land and all these things. Like something like, I think that's why China is coming up with the Belt and Road Initiative, because China, I think, is a country that really understands capitalism and its inherent crises. So for a country that big, they cannot afford for the international system to decline when they are the superpower. They're not the superpower yet, and they may never become that either. But I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to expand and connect all these developing countries or potential or emerging markets in a way that capital can expand without the creation of wars. I think somebody has provided an answer to the question I asked. I showed you the top importers of arms that are being exported by the United States, Russia, and other countries. So, and I told you there's India, there's Australia, and then there's Japan. What do they have in common is the question that I asked you. They're all part of what we call the Quadrilateral Alliance. And stay tuned because I'm talking about it tomorrow, okay? It's a defense, it's the Asian NATO, if you will. So there's four people in this Quadrilateral Alliance, and these three countries are part of it. Sasmi is asking, what about US-Russia relations currently? Well, US-Russia relations currently, I mean, they're not antagonistic to each other, but Russia has certainly made a comeback under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. And a lot of people do criticize Putin for his style of governance because it's not necessarily democratic. It's considered violent or has a lot of human rights violations or whatever, but that depends on how you interpret human rights violations. I mean, if you look at the masses that are dying in the United States because of COVID, isn't that a human rights violation, right? So you can interpret human rights violation in various ways, but for those of you who narrowly interpret it, they see Russia as a country that violates human rights, right? But definitely under the leadership of Putin, it has become very powerful, particularly in the area of military, but also in technology and other areas as well. They're not a direct confrontation with each other, but certainly because of Russia's alliance with China, the US doesn't consider Russia an ally. That's where things are at. Very quickly, I'm going to Dulandi's question, or in the current status quo, we see major contributors of international organizations pulling out. UK pulling out of the EU, UN from climate summits. What does this mean for world peace? Very good question, Yulandi. I think what we're seeing is a lack of confidence in international institutions because international institutions have not been able to deliver the world peace that you are talking about here, right? In a way, one could argue that the presence of international institutions in certain conflicts, particularly in the context of African civil wars, they have exacerbated those conflicts. So people are losing faith in these international organizations, right? I think even the Sri Lankan president made a comment some time ago saying that, we might also leave the UN. I don't think that's a good idea to leave the UN. Such a small country like Sri Lanka should not leave the UN because we make ourselves vulnerable for bilateral influences by very, very powerful states, right? We are surrounded by them. So it's not a good idea because the UN, one thing it has going for the UN is that all these small countries can at least unite with each other and work with each other. We can build coalitions in the United Nations General Assembly, right? You can build coalitions, and that is a strength for countries like ours that are very small, have almost, no or very little natural resources, very poor economies. We don't have much clout in no clout in international systems. So for us, the UN system is a great place because we can build coalitions with other countries, right? But of course, these coalitions come at a political price. Well, I think I think this is a great question for maybe a debate for the model UN to take up. What does this mean for world peace or for climate change if all these countries start pulling out of a common agreement, right? Perhaps we could think of regional agreements. I think maybe that's what the Belt and Road Initiative is trying to do, that China is trying to do. And India has a similar, it's not as sophisticated as the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but it also has this thing called Sagar, the concept called Sagar, which I will talk about tomorrow. All right, and there's another question. Will this ongoing unseen conflict between USA and People's Republic of China lead to a war in future? I doubt it, particularly now if you look at Joe Biden's, he's changing his position. He's not as confrontational as he used to be, but, or as Trump used to be, right? And if you remember last week, the United States took China off, Huawei, the Chinese tech company that the United States had banned as part of their trade war, right? It took it off the banned list. So it's doing certain things to show that, it's not going to be direct confrontation. And in fact, John Kerry, a previous senator, he said that we cannot solve any of the world's problems without cooperating or a dialogue with China. So I don't think there will be direct like war or direct confrontation. There will be friction, of course. These two are not friends. And they always, China is definitely seen as a threat by the United States. But China wants to cooperate with the United States, right? So maybe the United States will come around. We'll see. Then Laura is asking, do you think it would be possible to replace capitalism one day as it tends to collapse if we follow Marx? That's a great idea. It's a good idea, but I'm not sure whether it's going to be ever possible, Laura, because this capitalist system is too big to collapse. I think there's so many interests, so many countries are in it, that, and also we also kind of like it. I think we like it. Don't we like all these goods and services that are available to us? We like this system. We like to make money. We like profits. Although we may think that, all of us having the same house, same car, same job, working in factories, that kind of a system. I don't think we can all go back to that lifestyle, which Soviet Union used to have, like equality, right? Socialist system. But I think it's interesting. Your question is really interesting, and I'm going to, again, this is very good for another debate if you guys are going to have a debate. I would urge you to read about China's dual economy, because China says they're not an entirely capitalist country. They're trying to do capitalism with socialist characteristics. That's what they say. So what does that mean, right? I would encourage you to do some research on that and find out how China is managing this, because they're not entirely capitalist, right? So that might be an alternative. Okay, Sanithma, why are countries like the US spending so much for nuclear weapons? As in, does it make difference to have more nuclear weapons as opposed to less? Well, Sanithma, I think the military-industrial complex, right? They constantly want to keep beefing up their arsenals, because that's how they, they want to keep the threat of a rival. Like, it could be China today, it could be something else tomorrow, but they want to keep that threat real. That's why a lot of these, if you read the US media, right, there's always, it's as if US and China are going to go into war with each other. That's important for the weapons industry to keep manufacturing, selling, right? So yeah, you'll only see the nuclear spending, nuclear warheads, the number of nuclear warheads go up. Do you believe that the US is responsible for the creation of terrorist groups such as the Taliban? I do, actually, but I'm not going to answer your question fully, because I want to prove it to you. And maybe we can organize a different webinar so that I could walk you through that argument, why I think so. Okay. But long story short, I should give you a little answer. It goes back to, why don't you read about the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1970s, and then what the US did to get rid of the Soviet Union from the Eurasian region. Okay, if you read about that, you'll see what I'm talking about. Oh, what is your take on the current freedom war happening in Myanmar? That's a big question. Maybe we'll take it up tomorrow, yeah? Because we're going to talk about regional politics. Okay, recent report was released saying that India is behind the Easter attacks in 2019. What will a massive country like India gain by harming a non-competitive country like Sri Lanka? Well, stay tuned for tomorrow. We are going to talk about the Quad and what the Quad has in store for Sri Lanka. India is part of the Quad. How does this unrelenting impact of India affect local sovereignty? We'll talk about that tomorrow. Seeing that capitalism can cause, so save these questions for tomorrow. I wish I could save them. Seeing that capitalism can cause harm, why does it prevail? Because it's too big to fail, right? There's too many vested interests in it. Too many people are suffering from it, but there's a powerful few that are gaining from it. And those people make sure that it continues. Is it safe to assume that a major incident or revolution is required to change the current trend? I think you're a little Marxist in the making. Whoever said this, who is it? Guess it? Guess it. I think you should definitely read Das Kapital, because this is exactly what Marx said. So you would agree with Marx and Engels. So I highly recommend that you read it. Okay, somebody wants to talk about Adani. Maybe we'll do that tomorrow. Would walking away of major powers from the UN and the international organizations effect in a rise of land and power race within these nations in the world? Well, it's hard to predict that. And it's hard to predict that major powers will, all of them might walk away either, because that is also one way that they control the rest of the world. Do you believe that the US is responsible for the creation of terrorists? That was a question asked before. What is your opinion about the BRI? We'll talk about the BRI tomorrow, Sanitma. What sort of foreign policy would be more advantageous for countries like Sri Lanka in the future? I have an answer to that. Again, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Do you think, wait, did I miss something? Would importing a huge amounts of nuclear weapons from the Asian NATO be a future threat to countries like the USA producing them? No. You will see why tomorrow. A lot of these are applicable to tomorrow, actually. Do you think North Korea and South Korea has any? The number of questions are growing. Do you think North Korea and South Korea has any chance of reconciliation at any point, considering the after effects of such a case too? I don't think there is any chance of reconciliation at this point, given the political leadership of both the countries, Shania. Do you believe that certain wealthy families are controlling the world, such as the Rockefellers? Yes, possibly. Yes. They're controlling, I mean, if you look at where the Rockefeller money is being invested, what defense companies that Rockefellers are part of, you'll have your answer. Trinesh, do you think that Sri Lanka will one day fall under military rule like Myanmar? No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Sri Lanka has a pretty good democratic foundation, so I highly doubt that we would fall into military. There are no objective conditions in Sri Lanka to think. I mean, people might scare others based on hype or ideological leanings about how they look at the world, but I don't think. I mean, currently, I think these fears are coming from the fact that we have a person who used to be in the military as the current president. But if you look at, I mean, our democratic freedoms are intact, right? He may be from the military, but can you give me examples where, you know, democratic citizenship rights have been violated thus far? So far, we don't have any objective conditions for that to happen. And Sri Lanka is a multi-party democracy, a very vibrant democracy, where we have very high rates of voting and civic participation in politics. I doubt that, and Myanmar has a completely different history of democracy, that is, compared to Sri Lanka. So there is no reason to think that Sri Lanka will fall under military rule. What is your view on the UNHRC resolution brought against Sri Lanka? I think the United Nations Human Rights Council resolutions are never independent. They are always politically motivated, and they are politically driven by the countries that are powerful, which is the United States and the G7 and the G8 allies, who have only one way of thinking about countries like Sri Lanka, or one way of thinking about conflicts in other countries. So therefore, I don't think it's a fair resolution brought against Sri Lanka by these powers. And also, in an international system where we have principle of non-intervention in other countries, I don't understand or agree with why the Western countries have a right to interfere in the internal matters of a country. And that is simple as that. It's a violation of our sovereignty. And I'd be very happy to talk about this tomorrow also. Maybe we can schedule maybe we can extend the time to 2 hours. I didn't come prepared to talk for 2 hours today, but I can definitely do that tomorrow if you still want to ask these questions. Okay, there is a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Do you believe it's effective and successful, seeing the high production? No, I mean, NPT, you know, India and Pakistan, I think, both had already signed the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, when they then decided to go ahead and acquire nuclear arms, right? So is a treaty always successful? I don't think so. And as you saw, the nuclear arsenals in the world, they're only increasing, right? So it hasn't been efficient or effective in stopping countries from acquiring nuclear weapons, but I would say it has been effective in stopping countries from going to war with each other, right? Then would the military rule of Myanmar lead to a direct involvement in? Perhaps. I think there are lots of discussions going on at the moment in the United Nations Security Councils, Human Rights Council. So let's stay tuned for that. Do you think the Sri Lankan government is unaware of the real culprits behind the Easter attacks? As you know, there is a commission report out, and I'm actually doing a series of articles in Sinhala language. It comes up in the Aruna newspaper on Sundays. The first one was published last Sunday, where I am talking about the political economy of the Easter attacks in Sri Lanka. I'm talking about its global dimensions, regional dimensions, and the national or country level dimensions of the Easter attacks. So if you are interested, you could read. I can share with you what I wrote last week, and from this week onwards, I'll keep doing new articles. I think the government now has after this inquiry and the commission report, you can see that there is, the government does understand where and how and who is behind the Easter attacks, not just people who are in this country, but outside of the country. And I hope that due process will be followed, and those culprits, whether they were directly or indirectly involved in it, are brought to justice. If treaties aren't successful, why are they implemented? Because they're part of global deliberation, right? Like treaties are made, although some may violate these treaties, there's a lot of others who abide by them, right? So does that make the treaty useless? No, treaties aren't useless, but they don't have 100% success rate. That is what I'm trying to say. How does the Engel curve directly affect in capitalism, as we discussed today? Well, I think what Engels was trying to say is that, as the rate of profit declines, capitalism goes into crisis mode, and multiple crises and great depressions are created. In order to come out of these things, we create wars, because wars create an injection of capital by way of defense spending, right? Arms are made and people are buying them, people are selling them, armies are deployed, and you also take care of population problems because of war, right? So I think that's what Engels is trying to say, that there is an inherent logic in capitalism that drives it towards wars, because it cannot come out of its crisis. It starts a war, right? Starts a war, destroys things, and then new economies are born again, so to speak. Do you think that Russia and China and their allies support countries like ours in cases like human rights violations brought against us in the UN? Yes, they have historically done so. Russia and China have always been friends of countries like Sri Lanka, not because of anything else, because Russia and China both have strict principles of non-intervention in a country's domestic affairs, what United States and the G7, G8 allies do not have, okay? So because of that principle, they do support countries like ours in the Security Council. Then we have, I think we can take a few more questions and then we'll have to call it a day. We have, what exactly is the deterrence factor that treaties provide to prevent countries from breaking them? Well, treaties are, I would say, they're these commitments, right? They're commitments, they're principles based. In good faith, you sign a treaty saying, I'm not going to do this hereafter. But of course, you have all these countries, you see countries have defected these treaties. You can't prevent a country from defecting on a treaty if their national interests say that, okay, let's go ahead and, violate the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. I mean, if you remember, now we'll talk about India tomorrow. India was part of the non-aligned movement, right? But it violated it. And why? Because it had to put its domestic affairs before its principles. So there are times where you have to say that, we cannot abide by this treaty anymore, right? Can you please recommend some good and interesting books to read about Karl Marx, also in relation to war? Sarah, I think you should read Das Kapital. You can find, there is Marxism online. I think it's called marxist.org or something. It has translated all of Marx's writings and Engels' writing into English because they were originally written in German. So Das Kapital is what you should read. What are your opinions about socialist revolutions happened in the world, including the revolution led by the JVP in Sri Lanka? Was JVP a socialist revolution? Is the question I will ask you in return. It was definitely a class-based revolution that was premature. And it represented the interests of unemployed, poor, young men, particularly from the southern part of the country, primarily Sinhala. I don't think there were any other ethnicities that participated in the JVP insurrection. Well, as you know, there were two JVP insurrections, one in 1971 and the other one in 1987 to 1990 period. Now, you cannot conflate the two, saying that they were the same insurrection. They were different. The reasons in 1970 were different from the reasons in 1970. And the reasons in 1971 insurrection were different to the reasons that took place in 1987 to 90. But if you think about the causes of these insurrections, I wouldn't call them revolutions. They're certainly armed insurrections. Revolution is something that brings about social change or wants to change the status quo. The JVP insurrections just wanted to capture power. Okay, there was no revolutionary change they wanted to bring to society. They just wanted to capture power on both occasions. In the first occasion, in 1971, the JVP thought that by attacking all the police stations around the island at the same time, same day, that they would be able to capture political power in the country, right? In the 1987-90, also, it was the same sort of narrative. So I would question whether they were a socialist or like revolutionary, or they were just attempts to seize power. Certain groups attempting to seize power. Okay. All right. I think we'll have to stop the questions now. Very quickly, Swayari, Sri Lanka in some kind of severe economic recession in order for them to have gone into war with LTTE. Well, that's a very important question you ask. I think we should take it up another day because it has a long answer. We actually did not go into recession only because of the war. If you look at Sri Lanka's economic growth, Swayari, during the war years, our economy actually grew during the war, okay? Which you might like be shocked, like how is that possible? Now, it is quite possible for countries, and Colombia is the other example in the world. So Colombia, where you have the FARC, right? The narco wars in Colombia. You have the FARC and the state fighting each other, where in Sri Lanka you have LTT, and you had LTT and the state. You see growth amidst war, okay? So that means the economy is continuing, but the war economy is actually part of this growth, okay? But it requires a detailed explanation, which I'm afraid we are out of time now, aren't we, Sasindu? Arnav is asking, is it necessary to follow treaties? Countries are not obligated to do so. Like Pakistan always breaches international conventions like the Geneva Conventions. I understand where you're coming from, Arnav, and I respect that. Well, countries are not completely, I mean, they are obligated to uphold a treaty if they sign. I mean, why would you ratify something in parliament and you pledge that you're going to uphold that convention if you're going to turn around and flout it, right? But of course, Pakistan has breached some of these international conventions, you're right. But I think so has India, right? And so has maybe many other countries. So, and why do they do that? It's because of what they think is best for their national interest. I'm not going to take a side between India or Pakistan. I think it's a real bad way to go. But all I'm saying is try to look at the international system in this way. There are no permanent friends or no permanent enemies. There are only interests. And if someday India's and Pakistan's interests were to align, I'm sure they will work together, and maybe they will adhere to the same conventions and respect them and uphold them. So again, like, all of this boils down to national interest, right? Because we are still operating as nation states, not really as an international system. Okay. All right. Shall we take up the other questions tomorrow? What do you say?
We'll extend the time of the session, tomorrow's session, madam.
Yeah, I mean, if people are up for it, we can do, we can go for 2 hours. And I'm sorry to those of you who I didn't answer your questions today. Please bring them tomorrow. And then we'll try and go through each and every one of them. I had to keep my answers brief because some of you ask very profound, big questions that require long answers. Maybe, this is another, I think, a hint for the Ananda College Model UN to keep on organizing events of this nature so that you can all ask questions and engage very well. So I'm very happy about all the questions you asked. Great participation. And I thought you would not even pay attention to what I'm saying because all of you are tired. School has started and you have lots of hours of online school. But despite that, I can see that you have engaged, and I'm very, very grateful for all of you for paying attention and for asking questions. Keep it up. Thank you very much. And thank you to Ananda College for inviting me and for making this forum a really vibrant one, really well organized. And I loved your video at the beginning.
Thank you very much, madam. For those elaborated answers from the audience, and also we appreciate the engagement and interactiveness from our audience. We really appreciate that. So with that being said, now I'd like to invite Ravindra Karunaratne, the treasurer of our club, to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasindhu. And first of all, I'd like to thank Madam for giving us such a good informative session about capitalism and the logic of war today. We really enjoyed the session, and we were able to get some new knowledge to think in a new perspective about how wars happen and about the capitalistic economics supporting war. So, and also I'd like to thank all of the participants for this session and your encouragement and asking questions about the topic. And finally, also, madam, thank you very much again for joining with us, even with your tough schedule these days. So with that being said, the session 1 for the 2-day webinar about why wars happen will be ended now. And I hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much.